Hi everyone, my name is Leyla Kabuli, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences, where I'm a member of the Computational Imaging Lab advised by Professor Laura Waller. Today, I'll be presenting some of our recent work on information-driven design of imaging systems. Imaging systems allow us to gather data about the world around us, and we do this through pictures. We usually gather these pictures to be interpreted, processed, and analyzed by the human visual system, or by us. So usually we take pictures that we understand, those that look exactly like the things that we want to image. But we're increasingly relying on computers to process this data. So we use more and more sophisticated processing techniques, and that allows us to really push the limit of what an imaging system can be. And it opens up new capabilities for imaging systems. By including this computational processing, we have computational imaging systems. These combine an encoder, the optics, with a decoder or a reconstruction algorithm. So the example here is for lensless imaging, which replaces a traditional lens with a multiplexing optical element. So we produce a non-human interpretable measurement and then use a reconstruction algorithm to recover the object. Another example is radio astronomy, which combines telescopes from all across the Earth in order to capture frequency-space measurements of celestial bodies. The measurement doesn't look like, for example, a black hole, but then using a decoder, we're able to recover or reconstruct an image of the black hole from this measurement. So this mix of non-traditional optics and computational processing unlocks a lot of new insights that aren't possible with a traditional lens, and it also presents an important new question. How should we capture measurements for computational imaging systems? When we combine encoding with computational decoding, how should we design these encoders? So for example, if we want to replace a traditional lens with a mask, what should the pattern of that mask be? If we put telescopes on the Earth to image black holes, where should we build the telescopes exactly? If we want to do color photography, should we use a traditional color filter array, or should we use a different pattern that includes random or white patterns? And if we want to take pictures of cells with a microscope with an illumination pattern, what should that illumination pattern look like in order to get the best pictures of cells? So we've developed a new technique to answer these questions and more using information theory. So information theory is really the foundation of the modern digital world. It enables technologies including mobile devices and satellites and the computer interfaces that we rely on daily to communicate with others around the world and just with computers and machines as well. So what we'll do is we'll use information theory to answer our design questions for imaging. But in order to understand how this works, we first need to understand a few of information theory's core principles. So information theory is built on a generic model of a communication system. This was originally framed by Claude Shannon in some really groundbreaking work back in 1948. And to understand how this model works, we can take first an example of communication using language. So suppose I want to tell you about this piece of fruit. In English, the word for this fruit is going to be banana. But there might be some background noise on the Zoom call, so you might hear a distorted version of my voice. But then your auditory system will be able to still receive it, process it, and then have some evaluation and interpretation of it as a result. Now, reliable communication requires that the listener can correctly identify the word even though there's distortion. And reliable communication also requires that the distorted versions of different words that are communicated won't be confused with each other. So in this case, it works well because the two English words for these fruits are so different that even their distorted versions are distinguishable and they can be correctly processed. But what if we had a more ambiguous language where the words for these two fruits were really similar? Now, some distorted versions of these words will still be able to be correctly distinguished. But we'll have a problem with some of the others where it'll be impossible for the listener to determine what's trying to be communicated in this scenario. So with this weird language, we have uncertainty in communication. We can't tell what it is that we're trying to communicate. This uncertainty corresponds to low information. In contrast, English is an unambiguous communication method in this case. So the noisy signals it produces are super distinct, and the receiver has less uncertainty about what object's being communicated. So there's high information. So that's the intuition for communication systems and information theory, but let's see how imaging can fit into this communication model as well. So our source is going to be an object, and we're going to use an imaging system to encode that object into an image. When we record it on our detector, we're going to receive a noisy measurement of this image that includes some detection noise. We then take this measurement and we either interpret it with our brain or process it with a computer in order to yield some kind of an insight or analysis about our object. And just like the example with the fruit, our goal here is going to be to produce measurements that can be distinguished. This corresponds to having high information about the objects that we're imaging. And this is important because the more we can tell the different measurements apart, the more we'll be able to understand what were the objects that formed those measurements, what are slight differences in those objects. And then we can use this to get some more insight into how to design better measurements to better understand these objects. So we've gone over what information is, we've gone over how imaging fits into this communication model, and I'd like to take a minute or two just to understand why we want to use information to evaluate our systems. So if we look at traditional imaging system design, the goal has been for centuries to mimic the human eye. And we do this by using a lens that forms of an image of the object on the back of an eye or on a camera sensor. This is just the basics of how a camera works. And with these human interpretable systems, it's pretty easy to define what's a better system. It's going to be one that produces sharper images. And this provides very helpful design guidance if we want to build better traditional cameras, because if we want to make an image sharper, we can ask an optical engineer to add more optical elements, and then we'll get a better looking picture. But what happens when we have more factors besides the sharpness? So if we have this really good lens, this good optics, but we have a really bad sensor, will this system be inherently better or worse than a system that has a poor quality lens, but a really good sensor? So if we look at just individual design factors, our conclusions are going to be very different. But this is one of our motivations for using information, because information will capture all of this, all these performance aspects, including this bandwidth and this noise, just into one single metric. So that means with mutual information, we have a strategy that's useful for understanding these traditional systems. We can capture the sharpness, resolution, and noise, but we can also think about these non-traditional systems that capture really different measurements. So compound eyes like a bug's eye or a light field camera, or burst photography that captures many images for high dynamic range. These are all systems where the trade-offs are much more complicated than just sharpness and noise. But with the flexibility of information, we'll have a way to achieve this goal of understanding how to encode measurements in all these cases, not just for humans, in which case optical design's already been pretty solved. You should build a camera. But also for computers, because these systems can process many different types of measurements that don't necessarily look like a regular picture, but they still contain really useful object information. So in all of these use cases, we'll evaluate our encoders, our imaging systems, based on the quality of the measurements and the goal of trying to maximize how much information about our objects is in the measurements. So to calculate the information, we'll start with a model of our imaging system, just a way of relating each step of the pipeline to the others and account for physical constraints of the system. The way this works is we'll start with an unknown distribution of objects. These are the things that we're interested in taking pictures of and coding into noise-free images. And then we'll separately model the detection process, the noise as we record the image on our sensor, and this will give us our final measurement, Y. And now we'll evaluate these measurements to determine just how good is the system based on information. We take these measurements and we mix them together with the noise model that tells us how the sensor records the data, and use the two pieces together to estimate the mutual information between objects and measurements. This tells us what's the information available in the measurements about the objects, and it also tells us how different are the measurements from each other. So it captures all the design factors that come from the objects, the encoder, and the noise, all lumped together in one comprehensive metric. So then we can use this metric to try to design better systems, use this as a feedback loop, and ask how can we improve our encoders. So we've been over this intuition on information and our imaging system model, and let's see how do we actually calculate what's happening in this black box in our information estimator. So this is how the estimator actually works. Our goal is to quantify the information that's in the measurements, the mutual information. This is going to depend on the diversity or distinguishability of the measurements, how different they all look from each other. But a portion of this diversity is actually going to be due to noise alone, rather than the objects or the encoder that we use. So we want to subtract out the noise portion because it doesn't help us gain information about our system. In equations, this is defined as the mutual information. It's the difference of these two terms. So to calculate the term on the left, we'll need to just compute the two terms on the right. Specifically, we want to compute the entropy of the noisy measurements, h of y, and the entropy of the noisy process, which is the conditional entropy h of y given x. If we write out the full form of these entropies in terms of expectations, what we really just care about is seeing that there's two probability distributions these rely on. First one is P of y, the distribution of measurements, and the second one's P of y given x, the distribution of measurements given a particular clean image. Now, what's the probability distribution of noisy measurements? This tells us what are all the possible measurements that can appear in our imaging system, anything that we could possibly take a picture of. We don't know an analytic expression for this distribution P of y, but what we do have is a data set of measurements. We have samples that we've drawn from P of y. So we can take those samples and use them to approximate the distribution from those points. We do this by fitting a model. We approximate the probability distribution with something called P of theta that uses this data that we've captured. Second part, distribution of measurements given clean images, just describes what's the sensor's detection noise process. So this one's pretty straightforward. It depends on the noise model. Here I'll show an example for Gaussian noise. And we can visualize what this does by conditioning on a particular sample X. Now, given this sample, what we can do is visualize what are the possible outcomes given this X, with different draws that represent different possible noisy measurements based on the noise statistics of this Gaussian model. Now, if we put these two pieces together, we get our mutual information expression. And one way we can build intuition of what this is calculating is by looking at the different levels of noise and how they affect these measurements. So we have these three different sets of objects that we want to tell apart on the right side. And as we increase our noise, the measurements look really similar. It's hard to tell them apart from each other. And in the middle, those probability circles, they begin to overlap. We can't separate them. So when that happens, when we can't tell the images apart and the probability circles overlap, the information is reduced, and that's a poor measurement system. So we've developed this information theoretic method for studying the data that we capture from all sorts of different imaging systems. And we evaluate our systems just based on the measurements with the mutual information. And this is a big advantage over many existing approaches because most quantitative methods that we have, such as image reconstruction, require knowing the ground truth, exactly what's the object that we're taking pictures of. But the problem is we don't always have access to ground truth, especially in any experimental setting. But we always have access to the measurements that we've captured with the imaging system, even if we don't know what it is we're taking a picture of. So with this method, we've studied many computational imaging design problems, and I'm going to go over just a few quick examples to showcase the utility of the approach. So first, we tested our approach on traditional color cameras to answer the question, what's the best color filter array design? Now, we use color cameras everywhere, including in all of our smartphones. And the way that they all work is they have filter arrays that capture different colors at different pixel locations. And the conventional design for these filter arrays is the Bayer filter that I've shown right here. Each of these produces a measurement that's modulated by the color filter array, so you only capture the color that's at that filter. And then we take these measurements and process them to get a full color image across every pixel. But the thing is, there's many alternative designs that are possible, not just this Bayer filter. So we could have some kind of a random design, or we could have a learned design that primarily uses just white pixels. And now to understand what's the best color filter array design, we could consider a traditional evaluation approach. We'd process these measurements, and then we'd interpolate the color essentially at each pixel to reconstruct the full image from this array measurement. And then we can evaluate the filter's performance by just comparing the reconstruction to a known ground truth, whatever the object we're imaging is. With our approach, we're removing the reconstruction. We'll look just at the measurements. And we'll analyze the data set of these measurements that's produced for different objects. And for this data set, we'll evaluate the information with our framework that I've shown earlier. Now we can repeat this across many different designs and then compare their performance based on information. And this shows a very clear relationship. So when we have a color filter that produces more informative measurements, such as the blue point at the right of this image, these also have lower reconstruction error, so lower on the vertical axis. But we've been able to calculate this without doing the reconstruction, just from the raw measurements, and we still see this relation. In another example, we studied radio astronomy, specifically for black hole imaging. Here, we have a global array of radio telescopes that we use to take a picture of a black hole by combining the signal from all the telescopes. Basically, each pair of telescopes captures a curve in Fourier space, specific frequencies, instead of a regular image. And the open question here is, where should telescopes be placed on the Earth if we want to best image black holes? We could evaluate this with reconstruction. So we could decode the measurement and then look at the error between the reconstruction and the simulated black hole. And we could then repeat this for every single telescope configuration that we're interested in and pick the one that has the best quality reconstruction, the lowest error. But in reality, we can't do this because we don't actually know what our black hole may look like. And this is where mutual information analysis helps, because we'll just look at the measurements. We'll look at these different telescope arrays and take a distribution of black holes and get a data set of measurements for each one, and then run our information estimator in each case. And we find again that more information correlates with lower reconstruction error. So if our telescopes can sample more useful frequencies, it helps us produce both better measurements and better reconstructions. And now the last example system here is lensless imaging. In this system, instead of using a camera, you image an object by using a phase mask to encode measurements that don't look anything like the object to our eyes. And the open design question here is, what's the best phase mask that we can use for lensless imaging systems? So to answer this, we compared a diffuser design to a regular lenslet array and a traditional single lens system. Hopefully by now we know the drill. What we'll do is for each of the systems, we'll take the measurements and run a reconstruction on them, evaluate the error between the two based on the difference with the ground truth image, and then use just the measurements for our approach. We'll put our object through each of the imaging systems at hand, produce the corresponding measurements, and repeat this for many different objects that we could take pictures of. For each of these measurement distributions, we'll then estimate the information content. And what we find is these two methods are super correlated. So when there's more information, again, there's lower error. And this is true across many different noise levels as well, which is how we're labeling all the dots on this graph. Now I'd like to show one more thing we can do, returning to the color filter array. We can take the same feedback loop that we've been evaluating multiple different systems with, but actually optimize or design our optics automatically. And we'll do this by representing our optics with a mathematical model, which we call a differentiable forward model, and then use gradient descent, use gradient-based optimization essentially to search for designs that capture more information. We call this technique information-driven encoder analysis learning, or IDEAL. And now with the color filter array, here's an example of how it works. Our goal is going to be to improve the array design and maximize information. At each step, we'll update the encoder based on the gradients, and this will produce more and more information and better measurements at each step. If we freeze the animation, we can kind of see what's happening over the course of optimization. We can see that the information increases as we go further to the right, or the negative of the information decreases. And if we check the reconstruction performance through this whole optimization, again, we have this correlation between the two. So we optimize the encoder, we get more information on the bottom axis, and our reconstruction error gets lower on the vertical axis, even though we haven't optimized anything with the decoder. So putting all this together, we have a mutual information-based framework that lets us study and design many different imaging systems. We are in agreement with traditional reconstruction-based evaluation, but we don't need any ground truth data. We just evaluate systems using measurements. And this makes our approach really broadly applicable. So we can use the same mutual information estimation method to evaluate imaging systems, ranging from microscopy all the way up to radio astronomy. Summary of what we went over today. In today's talk, I've introduced a method for determining how to make good measurements for computational imaging systems. So we went over the foundations of information theory, which is how we understand the measurements. We went over the method for evaluating our systems, which uses mutual information based on just measurements and a noise model. And then we looked at examples for many different imaging systems using information to study and automatically improve the system's designs. There's a lot of other directions that we've continued in the work that I don't have time to go over today, but we're super excited about. We're continuing to develop new methods right now using information. And we use these methods to design, for example, for lensless imaging, improved encoders, even in experiment. And we're also branching out into many other applications here, including molecule localization and medical imaging. And of course, this work is not possible alone. This is done by a really wonderful team. And it's been really awesome to work with Henry, Eric, Nalini, and Tiffany on these projects over the last almost 5 years now. And if you'd like to learn more, you can visit our project websites. And for now, I'd like to thank you all for listening.